there. How are we doing? So you guys are at the squash courts, and if you're going to be at the squash courts talking about your feelings, I'm going to make a video on Vietnam. So go to the Vietnam outline, and what I want to do is save a lot of the stuff at home for us to talk about in class, and public opinion, what's going on at the elections, and everything like that. But this video is essentially going to be all about the fighting, all about how and why we get involved, and we'll talk a little bit about how things are resolved as well. And this is essentially going to be just such a quagmire of a war. And because of Vietnam, a little bit with Korea, but really because of Vietnam, we are never going to think the same way about foreign involvement ever again. And we're going to have major distrust in our government after this and the decisions they are going to make. And we just don't give up even when things are very clearly going badly in Vietnam. And if only our government did a little more retreating like you are today. Okay, let's get going. So we know that before we get involved in this, Vietnam belonged to France. That was in my last video about Eisenhower. And they came up with that North-South plan, which is not going to be a good one. And we know the colonialism is dying out. France decides they cannot hang on to them. And they have that Geneva conference, and they say, you will eventually vote for your own people once you're ready. And we did not support this because we were scared that person in the North was going to win. And that person in the North is a communist leader, and that is Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh was really popular, as people will be who are communist, to populations of lots of poor people. And we, again, with Eisenhower's domino theory, we had this fear that if, North Vietnam becomes communist, all of Vietnam will, then it's going to be other countries nearby, and obviously that's why we formed CEDAW. So the conflict is going to start to grow in the mid to late 1950s, and when we talk about Vietnam, we have to realize, yeah, LBJ gets nailed for it. All these presidents were involved. We can blame Eisenhower for Vietnam. We can blame JFK for Vietnam. There's not just one president that's going to get us here. It takes a long time for us to get entrenched, and then it takes even a longer time for us to get out with Vietnam. So as I said before in that last video, we backed this guy whose name is Diem in South Vietnam. Diem is not a good guy. He's a dictator. He is going to brutally punish any kind of dissent, any kind of Buddhist, free speech, anything like this, torturing, killing his enemies, and in a very shocking, very awful, again, on television, and very indelible image, monks, Buddhist monks in his country, are going to go into a busy intersection in the middle of the street, sit down and, pose in their meditation pose, douse themselves with gasoline and light themselves on fire in protest of his rule. So you're a pretty bad leader when people are setting themselves on fire. This is bad, right? But we're backing him because we're like, oh, not communist. That's all we care about. So opposition to him is growing in South Vietnam, and as you can imagine, Ho Chi Minh is looking better and better. And then there's going to be a group of people called the Viet Cong. Now, the Viet Cong are kind of like rebels. They are mostly communist South Vietnamese who want to overthrow Diem, and they keep getting weapons and support from Ho Chi Minh. And we're going to talk about how Ho Chi Minh sends them those weapons from North to South Vietnam through something called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And in 1956, fearing that he's going to lose the election, Diem just stops everyone from voting. He says no elections. Obviously, that's not going to go over well, and Ho Chi Minh finds this unacceptable, and the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, now teams up with the Viet Cong. Okay, so the Viet Cong are the rebels in the South that support Ho Chi Minh. The NVAs in the North, they come together, and they are going to start to now openly try to overthrow Diem. We begin to give supplies to South Vietnam, and a civil war is starting. Now we know a civil war, as we talked about in Korea, a civil war is within a country. What are we doing there, right? And we said this is such a hard call to make. Is this stuff our problem or not? Should we get involved or not? Is this something that is our business or not? Either way, this is a civil war we insert ourselves. So John F. Kennedy comes in, and we know that he is a very firm domino theory president, already had the disaster of Bay of Pigs, everything, and everyone said, hey, make Vietnam the place where you're really strong on communism. So he sends 16,000 advisors to Vietnam. So there's 16,000 people looking at a map and advising people? No, they're soldiers. We just don't say that, right? And we are getting more wary of Diem and actually conspire with the South Vietnamese to overthrow him, and he's assassinated. And Kennedy begins to hint before he gets assassinated, before he gets assassinated, after Diem is, that maybe it's not our place to be in Vietnam. But then we never know what he would have done because, of course, he is killed. So now LBJ's in office in 1963. He is inheriting a really bad situation in Vietnam. And again, he does so much good for civil rights with the Great Society, but Vietnam is just his albatross. It is just terrible what happens there. And we know Commander-in-Chief is going to, the president, send troops somewhere, right? But you need a reason. You don't necessarily need a declaration of war, but you need a reason. And he kind of gets one-ish. He lies. This is what happens. There's a ship, the U.S. Maddox. It's a Navy destroyer off the coast of North Vietnam. And he goes to Congress and on TV says, we have, quote, been deliberately attacked by the North Vietnamese. The ship, the U.S. Maddox, has been attacked. And Congress gives him, quote, all necessary measures to fight this. What the heck does that mean? All necessary measures. That could mean like sending atomic bombs. That could mean sending how many troops. This is way too much of this, a carte blanche, and it's not defined, and it's really scary. So this is called the Tonkin Gulf Resolution when he gets kind of the green light from Congress, August 7th, 1964. Only 2 senators said this was wrong. One senator said, we are giving him war-making powers, and there's not a war. Is anyone else disturbed by this? And the answer is no. If it's war, why aren't we declaring it? If it's not war, why are we sending troops? What's going on here? Later on, we find out LBJ lied. We attacked them first. Big difference, right? Them attacking us attacking them first. Wow, he lied because he wanted to send the troops. And remember, what is 1964? That's right, it's an election year. He wanted to be the tough guy on communism and get the votes, and he lied. And that is going to be really, really bad. So we are going to skip over parts of this next section, which is what's going on at home. But I do want to talk about what's going on with how we're fighting in Vietnam. So we have kind of 2 things that we're doing. There's the air war, which, as you can imagine, is dropping lots of bombs and chemicals and weapons. And then there's the ground war, which is essentially just going to be hell. It's terrible. So the air war is dubbed something called Operation Rolling Thunder, which is really a way of saying let's bomb the heck out of North Vietnam, specifically the Ho Chi Minh Trail, because that's how the weapons are getting down to the south. But here's the thing, Vietnam is a dense tropical jungle, right? How do you find the targets? You can't see them, so we come up with something called napalm. Napalm is jellied gasoline that explodes in fire. And we are going to drop that, burn all the trees. Defoliants, burn all the trees. Do something called cluster and carpet bombing to just like take out an area. Not that different from our policy of drone strikes right now, where we know that there's a target within a perimeter, so we just bomb the entire perimeter. Not that different. This is so destructive, and this is effective, but we're going to have, like, you can't just burn down all of Vietnam. This isn't going to work, right? And as this is happening, the South Vietnamese see these Americans that are there, and they're not really sure why they're there, and then they're burning down their homes and towns and everything else. And the more we bomb South Vietnam and try to tell them we're helping them, the more they join up with North Vietnam. The more these civilians are like, wait, you're not helping me. And then the more the USSR and China give weapons to North Vietnam. So I want you to think about this war as just escalating, 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 escalating. And then it's this big, awful, horrible problem. And we're like, ooh, how do we get out? That's where we're going. The ground war is going to be controlled by someone whose name is General Westmoreland. And we are fighting a guerrilla enemy, right? We are fighting an enemy who is going to have all these intricate tunnels underground and be fighting in the forest and then go into these tunnels and we can't see them. They know the terrain, they're doing surprise fighting, and they care about the cause. And think about these poor young guys who are 18 years old, these men who are going to be very poor. We're going to talk about this. Lots of very poor men are going to die and fight in Vietnam. Lots of men are black. And here they are, miles from home, fighting in a war that America at home doesn't really support. Of course the Viet Cong feel more for this than we do, right? We would go on search and destroy missions. We would go into places and look for the Viet Cong and not know where they were. And they don't have uniforms. How do we identify them? People don't speak Vietnamese. This is going to be impossible to tell the difference between villagers and between members of the Viet Cong. And we would go into these towns and evacuate everybody and bomb the town, and then we'd say it's for your own good. And of course, people aren't going to want that, right? They're going to be devastated. This is their home. Vietnam, lots of wading through rice paddies. searching villages, firing in the jungle, intense heat, terrible conditions. There were punji traps, which were sharpened sticks that would be covered with like grasses and leaves in a pit. So when you would walk on top of it thinking it was ground, you would instead be impaled by this. This is awful. Fighting in Vietnam is awful. I don't know if anyone's ever seen Good Morning Vietnam, if anyone did that for their project, or Forrest Gump, but this is, like I said, just hell. This is a cause U.S. soldiers are not connected to. We're not sure who to trust, who's on which side, and again, at home, there's not a ton of support, and we're not sure even the Vietnamese want us there. So morale of these soldiers in Vietnam is going to be a really, really big problem. We try something called pacification, which is where we go into a town and then evacuate it first before we bomb it and try to win over the South Vietnamese. No, if you're going to burn my house down and you ask me to leave nicely before you do, you're not my friend, right? So that's not really going to work. And we're inflicting enormous casualties with all this bombing and with all this fighting, as you can imagine. But we're not like taking a town or taking a city or saying we have this area. There's no way to do this except by counting bodies. So we would report these numbers back to the American people and say this many Viet Cong dead, this many. How do we know they're Viet Cong? We're going to be counting bodies of civilians by mistake. And again, more South Vietnamese are going to turn into Viet Cong because this is their home, because they're seeing it so bombed. And it's just awful. So these numbers continue to escalate. Escalate. You and I are going to talk about the U.S. forces and public opinion in class, so I want to save that and the anti-war movement. And I want to go back down to where it says a Tet offensive. I had a student who was Vietnamese, and she said it's not Tet, it's Thet. So that is going to be the Vietnamese New Year. And think about Washington attacking the Prussians on Christmas, right? Same kind of thing. Vietnamese troops, us, everybody, are going to be totally surprised when the NVA and Viet Cong attack South Vietnam on the New Year in Saigon. And there is a great musical called Miss Saigon, if you guys have ever seen it or heard of it, that takes place all in Vietnam, talks about all of these issues going on at this time. So 84,000 troops are going to not just attack the border, but actually get into South Vietnam. And this is a brutal attack. And think about these poor South Vietnamese people. We're attacking, now the North is attacking, and these people are saying, why are you here? Whose side should I even be on? There's such damage, there's such destruction, there's such brutality. The NVA is slaughtering people, and the South Vietnamese just want to be left alone. We hold them off during the offensive, but both sides suffer a huge loss of life, tons of casualties, and does it look like this war is going to be over anytime soon? It's just getting bigger and bigger. It's showing that they keep fighting. And the biggest takeaway from the Tet offensive is that we are not winning. It is now very clear we are not winning this war. All those reports of the body counts and everything else, we are not winning this war. And there's going to be major anti-war sentiments that follow. And again, that's stuff that's happening at home. So I want to talk about that together in class. So the growing doubts, the election in 1968, which is crazy, we will talk about in class together. And let's go to that part that says, as the war ends. Henry Kissinger is someone we're going to be talking about a lot. And we know now, we're going to cover the election in 1968, Richard Nixon is in charge. Richard Nixon is in power as president, and we're going to talk about him. But Kissinger is Nixon's national security advisor, and he has begun secret peace talks with the North Vietnamese in 1969. They're very hard to negotiate with. Nixon has come up with a policy of Vietnamization, because if we call it quits, it looks like we lost. And we don't want to admit defeat. And if we just like pull out, it's going to be unstable for Vietnam. So we decide we're going to trickle out our own troops little by little by little. And again, Nixon promised he would end this war. That's why he got elected. So now he has to make good on his promise, right? But Nixon is going to start more bombing, which you and I are actually going to talk about in class. I don't want to discuss this now, what happens in Kent State and everything, and that's just awful and brutal and turns more people against what has happened. And these secrets keep coming out of the fighting, what's going on in Vietnam, the civilians that are killed. You and I will discuss the My Lai massacre and the Pentagon Papers, and it is just awful, right? So the end of U.S. involvement, I'm going to talk about that very briefly. The election of 1972. This is Nixon running for re-election. And again, he lost a lot of popularity because of his increased bombing. The guy who said he'd end the war increased the bombing in other places like Laos and Cambodia. But he wins the election because months before, Henry Kissinger comes out and says, we are this close to peace with North Vietnam. Please don't do this right now. Hang on to this administration. If there's a new president, who knows what will happen. We're this close to ending the war. So the American people listen to that, and Nixon is going to be reelected. And then finally, you and I will talk about the 26th Amendment in class. Finally, January of 1973, peace talks between us, the North, and then South Vietnam agree that prisoners of war will be released. We will withdraw our troops from South Vietnam and help to rebuild it. But what of South Vietnam, right? What's going to happen to them? Think about Korea. All this fighting, all this stuff. What has changed? Nothing. You have North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And in 1975, now they're unstable. There's crazy evacuations of Saigon. It is just really terrible for the people who live there. This has been an awful time. Not to mention the poverty, the wartime destruction, what happened to their environment with the napalm, all this stuff, right? And in 1975, they are invaded by North Vietnam. Shocker, right? And lots of South Vietnamese are evacuated to the United States for safety, and their land is just demolished between the napalm and the defoliants. There was something called Agent Orange, that even for the men in the planes who dropped it, who were American soldiers, they came home with contamination and cancers later in their life from being just in the vicinity of this. Imagine people who are living there. This is your water supply, your soil, your farmland. 450,000 South Vietnamese are going to be dead at the end of the war, 1 million Viet Cong and NVA, and over 700,000 Southeast Asian refugees are going to settle in the U.S., a lot of which are here in Buffalo, as we know. In 1975, too, the Khmer Rouge, Rouge is in red as in communist, this awful communist terrorist group that's going to sweep through nearby Cambodia, kill 1.5 million people. This is genocide. So this region of Southeast Asia today has rebuilt and has done such great things and is now a huge boom for tourism and industry and all this stuff, but they are going to bear the scars of this for a very long time, as is our country, more psychologically than anything. And you and I will talk about that in class. So this is just a devastating war. This is such a sad war. I really encourage you, again, make sure you're listening to those decades clips. Make sure you're in touch with some of these movies and some of this, literature that's out there that talks about this. So many of these guys just need to get this story out, and it is immersed the vets and people who struggle with homelessness and mental illness. So many of them are Vietnam veterans. This is a war that shakes us to our core and really redefines America, how we trust the government, how we look at our president, and where we get involved next. Those words always, always are heard. Don't let this be another Vietnam. Whether we're talking about Afghanistan or we're talking about North Korea even today, or Syria or something like that, we have this intense fear that we will make the mistake as we did in Vietnam. So keep that in mind. I hope you guys are having a good time retreating, and be safe tomorrow with prom. You know what that means. Don't do anything